And I would now, at this point, like to introduce our speaker. Alyssa Ford Morel has been gardening since childhood and began propagating plants in high school. She was certified as a master gardener in 2012. She is one of the coordinators of the Glen Carlin Library Demonstration Garden. And for most people, that would be plenty. But Alyssa is also a master naturalist and coordinates the Audubon at Home program, which helps people certify their yards as wildlife sanctuaries. She will be speaking on the Hospitable Gardener, welcoming birds to your garden. Alyssa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and I am happy to be here. This presentation is kind of a sister presentation to one that I did last year called the Hospitable Gardener Welcoming Butterflies to Your Yard. And I'm following the same format for those of you who might have seen that one. It is based on my admiration for Judith Martin, Miss Manners, and her way of treating everything through the lens of good etiquette. So this is etiquette tips for hosts of avian guests and menu suggestions, because when we have guests over, we want to feed them. Before I get into it, I'm going to take just a second to let you take a look at this about the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia. As Colleen already said, you can submit all sorts of questions about identification of plants, diseases, insects, to the help desk, which is operating remotely. We have restarted a couple of our plant clinics, and more will be coming, and hopefully the help desk will stop being virtual soon. But the one thing that I want to emphasize about the help desk is that it is terrific. It really is something that you should feel free to make use of. I have been rather dismayed recently, some of the chat lists that I'm on in my neighborhood and so forth. People will post some really detailed, disease questions about their yard, insect questions to their neighbors, hoping that somebody might have already encountered this and will have a correct answer. And each time I see that, I weigh in and I say, please contact the help desk at the Virginia Cooperative Extension, because they will get you a good science-based answer quickly that isn't just based on hearsay. And fortunately, some of those people who I've recommended that to have gotten back to me and said, oh yeah, that's really good. It's free, it's no obligation, but it's there for your use. And that's really the heart of what Master Gardeners do. Okay. Moving on to our presentation, we are going to start with 7 do's and don'ts to be an excellent bird host. And I am going to try to be identifying the birds as I go through here. And I should say, I am not myself that great of a birder, but I happen to be married to a pretty terrific birder. So that's why I am very tuned into birds. And in fact, gardening for birds is the intersection of our interests. So this happens to be a flycatcher, probably a kingbird, flying up to its nest. I just think that's the greatest shot ever. So my first do is, at this moment in time, actually a little questionable, and that is, do offer a drink of water. A lot of you know that we are having a disease problem right now with birds in our local area, and that one of the things that some people are recommending is to remove your bird baths so that this disease will not be transmitted. I am going to talk a lot more about this before the first question break, a little bit deeper into my talk. But for now, I want to reassure you that I have spoken with some authorities on this issue, and asked them, I said, look, my very first thing that I'm recommending in my talk is offering a drink of water. This is so central to what people talk about when they talk about gardening for birds. And do I need to remove that? And they said, no, we are going to return to that. The removing of bird baths is optional, but what is definitely being asked is to clean those bird baths, which I would have been recommending anyway, but in particular, sterilize them with a 10% bleach solution and then rinse incredibly well before you put anything back out. The two authorities that I spoke with did themselves say that they had removed their own bird baths. So that might be something you want to do. But in the meantime, for the future, when this disease is figured out and we know what to do about it, we are quite confident, including the people working on this disease, that offering water will continue to be important. So I'm going to start this little video that is really tiny, but you can see this is my front yard and there's a little male robin taking a bath there. Birds need water both for drinking and bathing. It can be a beautiful, rather fancy fountain. It can be a very simple bird bath. Here's one bird that has found a dripping faucet. This is a ladderback woodpecker. And just to identify these, this is a hermit thrush here, a worm-eating warbler, excuse me. And this picture is my own backyard, a winter a couple years ago, where we've got a flicker that has come in to take a drink from my winter feeder, which has a hookup so that it keeps the water from freezing. This is when my bird bath is actually at its most popular because sometimes when the ground is frozen, the water is also frozen. And so finding a good source of water in winter is important. And here's a mockingbird patiently waiting his turn, which I just think is adorable. I recently did see on one of the Facebook groups that I'm on, somebody was trying to claim that it's a bad thing to have water for birds in winter because if they bathe in it, the water will freeze on their wings and they'll be unable to fly. That is a myth. In case you hear that, just want you to know that's not an issue. If the bird needs the bath in winter, they'll take the bath. They know how to keep the water from freezing in their feathers. A reminder for you that birds in general are used to finding water on the ground. They do not actually usually fly up to water. They're usually flying down to a spring. So you don't need to have a raised bird bath. Often just a little dish of water on the ground is something that they're going to like. They cannot use a really deep pool of water. They'll drown. They don't, unless there's some sort of a water bird, they don't want to swim in the water. They just want to dip into it. So if you have a deep bird bath, you might need to put some rocks in it so that they can stand on the rocks and just be lightly submerged. And they don't really like slippery bird baths either. Those little claws are used to gripping into things, but not onto, something slick plastic. So think about those things as you are deciding what bird bath to use. Certainly, and this was in this presentation before this disease problem came up, bird baths need to be kept clean and free of chemicals. And certainly just to keep mosquitoes away, we recommend cleaning the bird bath out every other day at the very least. And periodically using something, whether it's bleach or some other sterilizing solution. I keep a brush handy and brush down my bird baths quite frequently. But if you use anything, rinse that bird bath like nobody's business because you don't want birds getting any trace of chemical when they go to take a drink. Okay. The next thing that birds need is they need some shelter and safety. particularly when we're talking about when they want to drink or feed. Most birds want to come to a safe place and survey their environment before settling in for the somewhat risky business of eating and drinking. Here is a really cute little towhee that is in this spiky bush before doing whatever he's going to do. This will provide some safety to him from hawks. Hawks are certainly birds, and they often like to feed at feeders. They just feed on the birds that are eating there. And so having some shrubby things close to your baths and feeders will be a big help. This happens to be a fringe tree, a native little understory tree that is in my front yard and has been exactly where the birds like to come in before they come get a drink or go to the various, we have had feeders, and we have lots of native plants that they can feed from. And here's a little hummingbird in that fringe tree that perches there first before it goes on to drink nectar from our flowers. And so just the natural structures can be very important. This photo shows that there are many layers of structure that you can build into your yard. And that's what birds really like. Different birds like different levels. Some want to be on the ground, some want to be very low, just above the ground, some want to be higher, and some want to be in tall trees. And you can help all those birds by providing all those layers of plants. Another thing that you can do is to deliberately build a structure that they can use. I believe that on this very session is the people from whose home this brush pile is. This is a brush pile that is kind of easy to do. You can see they had a fence in the back and they put up a couple of posts. And now when big branches come down, they simply pile them back there. And it doesn't become too messy for us humans, but it's a great area for birds and for other wildlife to hide in. It's great not only for birds, but for all sorts of amphibians and reptiles too. Rock piles may be good. Sometimes just overhangs from your house. I am always fascinated with the mourning doves that like to use our yard. I can pretty much guarantee at almost any time of the day, we've got some mourning doves that are hanging out in our house. And if it's rainy, they're under the eaves. If it's sunny, they're out in the sun, soaking up the sun. So that's something you can do, is keep providing those structures. If you are going to put in a bird house, which can be really nice, I really suggest that you study what kind of bird house works for the kinds of birds that you are trying to attract. The adorable bird houses that are so cute are often not actually built for the birds. They're more for us to look at, which isn't so bad, but some of them aren't really safe for the birds. I know that there is a kind of a ceramic bird house sold, I think it's known as the Williamsburg bird house. And I heard one naturalist say, yeah, we call those bird cookers because they just heat up too much and birds really can't live in them. If you're going to look at putting in a bird house, find one that is specific to the kind of bird that you're trying to attract. That often means that it has the right size opening and it may or may not have a little perch coming out to help it get in. Some birds don't want that. Mount it where other things cannot get at that bird house. On a high pole, and you may need to do what my husband and I did this spring. If your shrubs have grown up close to that birdhouse, you may need to prune them back a bit because the shrubs may prove to be a good launching pad for squirrels or even snakes to get into that birdhouse and steal the eggs. Eggs are delicious to all sorts of other wildlife, and they will definitely access the eggs in a nest if they can. So be careful about doing that. We want to really suggest that you consider a dead tree to be a treasure, a snag. That's what we call dead trees. And if you are lucky enough to have a snag, it is a wonderful thing for the birds. There are approximately 85 species in America that use cavities in dead trees to make their nests. And not many of them will easily switch to a birdhouse. You know, you could say, yeah, well, the birdhouse is a cavity. Some will switch, but not all of them are. And a lot of the cavities that are around are taken by two different invasive species, house sparrows and European starlings. So that cuts down even further on the availability of cavities. The same folk who had the brush pile that I just showed you had two very large trees that died in their backyard, but because they're birders, they made a point of lopping it off rather high up where it's safe so that if it does tumble down, it's not going to hit anything terribly important. And these snags have been, you can see this one has actually been pretty much denuded by the birds coming in, because what happens is in a dead tree, I have heard it said a number of times that a dead tree has more life in it than a living tree because of the amount of insects and microorganisms and fungus that go growing in there and feed on all the nutrients that that tree built up over the years. And that's a lot of really important biodiversity and is very valuable to lots of birds. Two of our most iconic cavity nesters are the pileated woodpeckers here you can see feeding the babies. And this is great horned owls. This is over by Fort C.F. Smith. These owls have been using this particular snag for years, and they are just, I say any day you can see an owl is a good day. So also very important to do is to leave the leaves. And I'm running this little video. I'm sorry it's so small, but you can see this cute little robin here running around in my yard, and I'm sorry, that's looking through my window, but you can see she is gathering dead leaves and particularly dead bits of grass that I left in place over winter to make her nest. Not only are the dead leaves important for nesting, but because dead leaves are really essential to insects. And here comes one of the themes that is going to be popular in my presentation today, and that is the not just importance, but actual completely critical nature of insects to birds. Insects provide most of the food to so many of our birds, and particularly caterpillars. Caterpillars are what a huge proportion of our birds feed to their babies, because except for about 5% of birds, birds feed their babies protein. And the easiest to find, easiest to digest protein is caterpillars. And so birds are looking for caterpillars to feed their babies. And a study that was done by Dr. Desiree Naranga under the tutelage of Dr. Douglas Tallamy, who is one of my heroes, Dr. Naranga, in her PhD study, looked at the nesting habits of chickadees here in the greater DC area. And she found that one nest of chickadees, the parents need to feed their babies between 4,000 and 9,000 caterpillars from the time those babies hatch until about 2 weeks later when they fledge out of the nest. And then the parents keep feeding them even more caterpillars as they're learning how to forage for food themselves. That is a huge, huge number of caterpillars. Caterpillars are, of course, the babies of Lepidoptera, butterflies, skippers, and moths. And so the abundance of Lepidoptera is really important. And here's the thing, I know this is going to sound silly, but I never until fairly recently thought about what happens to butterflies over winter. I knew I didn't see them over winter, but I didn't really think about where they were, what happens to them, because in the spring, they don't just spontaneously generate, they come from somewhere. And the truth is that most of them are overwintering in leaf litter, either as eggs or as caterpillars or as sometimes adults. Leaf litter is what nature provides. It is a safety area for all sorts of insects to overwinter. It provides warmth. Leaves turn out to be exactly what plants need as far as nutrition. And as the leaves decompose, they feed all sorts of microorganisms in the soil, creating wonderful, nutritious, healthy soil. I have a lady that I garden with who has for years just been leaving her leaves, and her soil is so lovely and loamy and easy to dig in. You start raking those leaves off perpetually, and the soil never gets to regenerate its organic content, which is always what's going to have a lot of what makes the soil healthy. Not only should you be leaving the leaves, you should be leaving some of the plant stems that are an inch or so, excuse me, not an inch, a pencil diameter or so in width, that are of native plants, will very likely be where a number of our insects, particularly some of our bees, we have 4,000 different kinds of native bees in North America, and a lot of them like to lay their leaves in the stems of plants. The bee houses that are so popular now and people are buying are only, frankly, poor imitations of stems that are left over. Heather Holm has figured out quite recently that the bees like to lay their eggs in the hollow stems of native plants the second winter after they have grown. So what is being advised is that you cut the stems down to about 2 feet tall and leave them for 2 years. By that second year, they'll probably break down by themselves, but you will be providing a wonderful choice of natural preferred habitat for native bees. I already mentioned that leaves provide great nesting material. You can see this cute little robin's nest here that's full of pine needles. So that's an important thing. But do wait until full spring to clean up. And I have to admit a secret that I have been learning that the longer you wait, the less you have to clean up. If you will leave your leaves, they'll just keep breaking down. You might want to rearrange them. If your yard is like mine, they kind of tend to pile up in drifts. So in some areas, they're super thick, and in other areas, you don't have any. I'll rearrange the leaves. I'll move them around from one area to the next. But if you have a nice even layer of leaves, they're going to break down pretty quickly, and they really start to look pretty good pretty quickly. Don't rake them up, though, if you want a hard time. Wait until the ground is, and the nights have risen in temperature. You want nights to be at least 50 degrees or more. In our Northern Virginia area, that's probably early May. So leave it for a while, and maybe you'll find that you can leave it for even longer. If you do want to mulch something, you can put mulch right over those leaves. You don't have to remove the leaves first. And just to identify these birds, so this, of course, is a robin. And then we've also got here I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. This is a hermit thrush. I didn't want to get it wrong. And of course, it was a robin that we were looking at in the video. Next thing, and this really ties in because I just talked about how important the insects are. Don't kill their protein. They need protein. Do not use pesticides. Do everything you can to stay away from pesticides. As I said earlier, 96% of songbirds feed their babies protein. And in fact, the insect flush that we get in North America is really the reason that birds migrate from South America. Believe it or not, our temperate forests provide a bigger flush of insects than the tropics do. And that is why the birds come from the warm wintering spots in South America and make the incredibly long and arduous journey. In our area, most of the birds have flown across the Gulf coast. They've gone across the water for absolutely sometimes days. And they are arriving, first of all, really hungry for their migration. And it is from their migration, and they really quickly need to get some protein into them. And then they want to go about the business of making babies. And making those babies is dependent on getting a lot of insects. And there's enough more insects in North America, or traditionally there has been, that it has made it worth them that they can raise a few more babies up here than they could in the tropics. And that's why they come. But as we have been systematically killing the insects for years and years, decades and decades, we have been wiping that out. If you'll think back, if you're as old as I am, when you were a kid or a teenager, if you were driving around, every time you went to a gas station, you had to clean your windshield because there were so many dead insects on the windshield. That's not happening very often anymore. We have for decades been waging systematic war using chemicals against insects, and we have been winning that war. We thought that there were so many we could never make a dent in it, but it's just not true. Pesticides in general do not discriminate against which insects they kill. People are very fond of talking about, well, I only want to kill the bad insects, the aphids, the ones that, eat the plants. Well, you know what? With very few and very limited exceptions that are usually targeted at larvae or even eggs, pesticides don't discriminate which insects they kill. When you spray for mosquitoes in your yard, you are killing any insect that comes in contact with that insecticide. Pesticides also kill life in the soil, which the soil should be incredibly abundant with life, but pesticides will kill that life. Again, people think that if they use organic pesticides, somehow that will mean that they're not killing the good insects. Well, guess what? There's still pesticides. I had a guy come to my door touting, a pesticide spray that he wanted to put in my yard. And I very politely said, thank you. No, if you look around at the plants that you're standing amongst, I've planted those specifically for the insects. And he said, oh, well, you're in luck because our pesticide is made out of chrysanthemums. Do you know what that is? And I gritted my teeth because I do know what chrysanthemums are. And it's made out of chrysanthemums, so it's not going to hurt anything. Well, guess what? If it works on one insect, it's probably going to work on all of them. I had another person, a good friend, who's very intelligent, and we were talking about neonicotinoids, which are made out of tobacco. The word neonicotinoid comes from nicotine. And she was saying, oh, surely it can't be that bad. It's made from a plant. And I looked at her and I said, are you trying to tell me that tobacco doesn't kill? And she realized what she was saying and backed off of it. Fungicides, there's some studies being done that make it look like fungicides may be just as bad at killing things. So we as master gardeners always want to recommend that you use non-toxic controls as your first choice. If you have aphids, get a hose, wash them off. If they are clinging, take your hand and run them up and down as you're washing it off. If that grosses you out, put on a little latex glove before you run your hand up and down that plant stem and knock off the aphids. Try that first before you move on to increasingly toxic things. But most of the time, if you cultivate natural controls, you are going to be able to deal with the problem. I love showing this picture. People who do vegetable gardening usually recognize that this is a tobacco hornworm or tomato hornworm, but they may not recognize what it looks like little kernels of rice on there. And in fact, I like to call this picture a dead worm crawling, because that worm has been already parasitized by a tiny parasitic wasp that has laid her eggs on that worm, or caterpillar, which they've now created little cocoons. And very shortly, those little tiny baby wasps are going to hatch out, and they are going to eat that tobacco hornworm from the inside as he's living. It's pretty awful. You can't see a horror movie with anything scarier than that. But here's the thing. If you remove that hornworm, then the parasitic wasp won't have anything for her babies to eat. And so it really is a matter of letting nature find its balance. I'm not trying to tell you that you must let the tomato hornworm eat your tomatoes. Another master gardener years ago suggested that you try moving your tomato hornworm to one of those volunteer tomatoes that always seem to come up in your yard, where if you've been growing tomatoes for a while, and let that be your sacrificial tomato plant. Let the hornworm eat that. It will hatch into quite a nice moth if and when it makes it through to maturity. And you need to say, okay, that's worth that trade. Another picture here shows a red bud with all these little circular holes here, which you might say, oh no, that's an insect. I need to do something about that. Well, in fact, this red bud has been used by leafcutter ants, and they cut out these very distinctive round holes at the edge of the leaf, and they roll them, and they make what looks like little tiny tobacco, little cigars, and that's what they lay their babies in. So when you see a plant that has these kind of polka dots, you should be celebrating and saying, oh, the leafcutter bee has decorated my leaf with some polka dots, and that means that it's being used appropriately. One of the memes that I've seen that I really like says, if nothing's eating your garden, then your garden isn't part of the ecosystem. One other thing I like to point out, a lot of people don't know what this is. In fact, I think it looks vaguely scary, even though it's really tiny. It almost looks like a tiny little alligator to me. But this, in fact, is the larva of a ladybug or a lady beetle. Unfortunately, this one happens to be an Asian ladybug. I just haven't been able to get a picture of one of the native ladybug larvae. They're often called a ladybug lion. And what people don't understand, a lot of people know that ladybugs eat aphids. What they don't know is that the larvae eat way more than the adults do. one of my Facebook groups that I belong to, someone posted a picture just very similar to this and said, I used an app that identifies insects and they said that it was a ladybug, but I know it's not a ladybug. And of course, everybody chimed in, yes, it is a ladybug. It's just a baby. So now you know what a ladybug baby looks like. And to identify these birds, this, of course, is an eastern bluebird. This is a brown thrasher. And here is a cardinal eating a cicada, which most of us in the national capital area know all about these days. One last thing before we leave this, here's another meme. All your life you've been told these are bugs, but they're not, they're bird food. So just try to reframe, change your standards, and start embracing the diversity of life that can be in your yard, and your birds will love it. Next, do remove invasive plants. I have a real burden about invasive plants. People use the term invasive incorrectly all the time, and I don't really blame them. It's an easy word to use. They tend to use it when they're just talking about a plant that has spread too much in their yard. But an invasive plant has a rather strict definition from, believe it or not, a presidential order, Executive Order 13112. And it says that an invasive plant must be non-native to the area in which it is existing, where it is found, and also capable of establishing itself in the wild, escaping the garden, and outcompeting native plants and causing harm in one of three ways: to human health, to the economy, or to the environment. And most of the time, what we're talking about with invasiveness is harm to the environment. So invasiveness is not about how the plant behaves in your garden. The word to use if you've got a plant that is doing what you don't want is that it's aggressive in your garden. It may or may not be also invasive. Invasives, as this executive order says, need to be capable of escaping your garden and getting into the wild. But at this point, we have so many plants that have done that and have established themselves in the wild. And here you can see, this is just off of the WNOD trail, where it is absolutely covered with porcelainberry and other invasives. So our wild places are so covered with invasives that the invasives are now escaping the wild areas and getting into our own yards. This is a tiny English ivy that I have pulled up in my own yard. I am constantly pulling up English ivy, porcelainberry, bush honeysuckle, and it's a really good idea to start getting to know some of these plants when they're tiny so that you can pull them up when they're easy. Bamboo is such a nasty invasive, almost impossible to get rid of. This is right close to my house, and the county had to come in finally. This is a group of volunteers. We were trying to do it. We could not get rid of this bamboo. Over here is another, right in the same area as that bamboo, but slightly over. This is actually one of our local representatives who came out, and this twist that he's got in his hand, and there's two different twists here, but they're both of invasive Asian wisteria. And if you can look closely at the tree behind it, you can see where this twist was. It was strangling that tree. And in fact, unfortunately, that tree ended up dying. And yes, the wisteria is absolutely beautiful when it's in bloom. No question there. Almost all invasives were brought here deliberately because of some good aspect to them, including beauty and hardiness, and especially because when you bring them out of their native habitat, often in Asia, around here, most of our invasives are from Asia, you don't bring their insects that usually keep that plant in check. And so here, the insects that live here and have co-evolved with our native plants can't eat these invasive plants. And so the invasive plants go absolutely wild. They have a competitive advantage because they leaf out early and they stay green later than natives. So they really are a problem. If you are not sure if something is invasive, you can research your local lists because the official list of what is invasive varies from place to place. For instance, here in Arlington and Alexandria, pampas grass is not considered an invasive, but in California, it is absolutely an invasive. Not that it's any more native here, but it doesn't spread like it does in California. So if you want to know what the invasives are in Arlington and Alexandria, this is a link for you that you can take a look at. And then you do need to do some research about how to remove the invasive. Some of them are really, really challenging. Another important thing about invasives is that while they may have berries or other aspects that birds may indulge in, usually the nutrition provided by them is really poor. I've already talked about how the birds around here do this incredibly long migration, and they need a lot of protein and fat before they make their migration. Well, guess what? The birds in Asia don't have that kind of migration. Their migration is very much shorter, and they do it in smaller bursts. And so what they're really looking for is some high sugar. And the plants that have come here and make berries still have that high sugar content, which the birds may enjoy, but it's not what they really need. They need the protein and they need the fat. And so here we come to a plant that is especially bad for birds, Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo. There has been at least one study where a group of cedar waxwings, which are known that when they find a big group of berries, they kind of like to gorge on that. They have a little feeding frenzy and eat everything they can. And unfortunately, a group of cedar waxwings did that on Nandinas, and they died. And necropsies were done on them, and it was shown that there was toxicity in those berries that killed those cedar waxwings. Now, that is probably because they gorged on it. Probably if they had not eaten so much, they would not have died. But there are small levels, I believe it's cyanide, in the heavenly bamboo, and that cannot be good even in small quantities for any birds, and certainly not for cedar waxwings. The good news is if you have some Nandina, you can remove it, and that's what we would urge you to do. But if you can't remove it immediately, at least cut those berries off so that any birds visiting your yard do not eat them and deal with whatever kind of health issues they might have as a result. Okay, number 7, do offer them the healthy food that they need. We've just been talking about what not to give them, invasives, and instead they need the native plants. We've just talked about how nutritious the berries are and the seeds and so forth, also because the native plants support the insects. The plants are the basis of our local food chain, and if you don't have the diversity of native plants, then you won't be supporting the diversity of native insects. Native insects tend to specialize on which plants they have evolved with, co-evolved with over the centuries, and they can only eat certain plants much of the time. The good news about native plants is that here in Northern Virginia, we've got a great selection. We are at the bottom of the northern range of plants and at the top of the southern range of plants. We can use plants, we're not too far from the coast, we're not too far from the mountains. So there's this huge variety of plants. We also are super lucky in Northern Virginia to have great information about native plants. If you are not familiar with Plant Nova Natives and this wonderful book, Native Plants for Northern Virginia, you should acquaint yourself with this book. This is not something that you can find for every area around here. There's great documentation about what plants are native here, and Plant Nova Natives has been working really hard to increase the availability of local native plants. And nurseries are carrying more and more of them. We have several specialized nurseries in Northern Virginia that cater just to, that do just native plants. So that's really great. One thing I want to talk about is that, I've been talking about how native insects will eat our native plants. And as the wonderful Alonso Abugadas, who is Arlington's director of, now I'm blanking out on his title, Wildlife Services. I'm getting that wrong. Anyway, Alonso always says that it would be a very poor evolutionary strategy to have a insect kill the plant that is dependent on. Instead, the insects access bits of what they need from the plants, but they don't kill them. They maybe do a little bit of visual damage, but if we can adapt our eyes to that, the plant is absolutely going to be okay with what our native insects do to it. Now, I already mentioned the study done about chickadees by Dr. Desiree Naranga and Dr. Douglas Tallamy. And that study helped us come up with this very helpful number, at least I find it very helpful, that if you really want to support enough insects so that there's enough insects that the birds can eat them and raise their babies, like the chickadees did, you need to have about 70% of your biomass in your yard being native. Biomass, think about it. A tree is a heck of a lot of biomass. So if you've got some big trees in your yard, you're probably coming, and they're native, you're probably coming close to achieving that goal. If you have a lot of non-native trees, you may not be able to achieve that balance even if all of your perennials are native. So that's a helpful goal. But the good thing about that is, for me as a gardener, I fall in love with plants. And sometimes I want plants that aren't native because I've just fallen for them. And so 30% of your plants can be non-natives. It's not telling you that you can't do anything except for native. You can do non-native plants, just keep it in balance. And of course, the last reason that is a good thing about having native plants is that they're just beautiful. I mean, look at this zizia over here that's just in beautiful bloom in the spring. And our American beautyberry, I think, is much prettier actually even than the Asian beautyberry, because these gorgeous purple berries are bigger on the American version and they go all the way around. And look at this adorable tiny baby catbird who was eating our American beautyberries over at the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. And he was so small and just learning how to feed himself that he really didn't mind when I got up close to take his picture. Now, you can't talk about natives these days without talking about cultivars. And what is a cultivar and are they okay? A cultivar is something that has been bred. Sometimes it's naturally occurring, and sometimes it is not naturally occurring. Sometimes people have taken a native plant and bred it for certain characteristics. And what the studies are showing are that cultivars risk being less attractive or nutritious if you've changed a couple of things. One is if you've made the flower be fancier and particularly made it be what most people call a double flower, like this echinacea that has been bred. Essentially, it has a whole bunch more petals coming out of its center area. And the birds cannot get into what is very easy for them to get onto in the straight species, which are the nectaries and the pollen. That's what really needs, what so many of our birds and insects need, is they need access to the nectar and pollen. And if it's all covered up, it's no good to them. Also, if you change the color of the leaf, the color is usually changed by an increase in particular defensive chemicals within the plant, and it usually changes the taste. You can think about this yourself. If you think about the different colors of lettuces and how a lot of the more red colored lettuces have a different flavor, often a bit more bitterness when you eat that lettuce. Now, that can be fairly nutritious, but it's often, when we're talking about a plant that the bird wants to eat, to the extent where the bird won't eat it. So this is a straight species 9-bark that has a nice green leaf. But you can see here are 3 different cultivars that have been changed for color, and the birds and the insects are not going to be as interested in eating those leaves. Now, if it's been changed for size, you're probably safe. So if you are looking for a smaller shrub than the straight species, and the only thing that's different is that it isn't going to grow as tall, you're probably going to be okay to use the cultivar. Moving on, and here's what probably a lot of you have been waiting for, information about ways to keep our birds safe. I'm going to talk first about the fact that studies have shown that 2.4 billion birds, yes, that's with a B, are killed by domestic cats. You could make an argument that cats are an invasive species in America, particularly those feral cat colonies. We really need to start working on changing our idea of what is appropriate for having a cat, and that is that it should be kept more like a dog, where if it's going to go outside, it will be on a leash and unable to hunt. I never blame the cats. It's their nature. I love cats. These are 3 of my cats right here. Fascinated by wildlife. We are all bird watchers, but my cats do their bird watching from indoors. Another danger to birds is window strikes, which are estimated to kill somewhere between 97 and 976 million birds each year. That's a huge number. Window strikes means when a bird flies into your window. And it's usually because it is confused and it sees the reflection in your window as an extension of the outdoors. You probably know, if you have windows, that get bird strikes. If you do, you should really look into some sort of device to help them not fly into your window. Usually, if a window has screening over it, the screening kind of shields that reflection and also provides a little buffer if a bird does hit it. But straight windows often are very confusing to birds. If you were to be able to look around my room that I'm sitting in right now, this picture in the upper right is actually just to my right. It's my screen window. And we have put these little practically see-through tapes 4 inches apart across the part of my screen door, my sliding door that doesn't have a screen on it. And it has really, really cut down on the bird strikes. It really works. And in fact, it does not seem to cut down on my view out to my yard. I'm a little embarrassed. I'm showing my messy potting area there, but it's a good thing. You can research that a little bit. We've already talked about how pesticides are, I just want to give you one little statistic. Apparently, one kernel of corn that has been treated with neonicotinoids can kill a songbird if it eats that one kernel of corn. So that's just a reinforcement. And then finally, what was in this presentation as I started building it weeks ago, and has stayed here and is all the more important right now, is that if you have bird feeders, they must be kept clean. Bird feeders are really more about the people than the birds. We have bird feeders because we want the birds to come where we can see them. If we have planted the native plants and created a great landscape, that's really all the birds need. That's what they truly need. The bird seed, yeah, sure, it brings them in. We get to see them. I admit, we usually have a bird feeder hanging right outside my kitchen window, and I take such great joy seeing the birds come into that feeder. But for the most part, the birds don't need that seed. That's not how nature evolved them. They're smart. They're going to come take advantage of it when they can, but they don't need it. And right now, we do have a terrible, unidentified disease that is hitting the DC area, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. And I have just learned that it is showing up in some other states too. They have found cases of this disease in Kentucky, Ohio, and I'm forgetting the third one. I think it's Illinois. Limited numbers of this disease. The disease manifests itself primarily in juvenile birds as an eye problem, and it's really nasty. It blinds the birds and goes on to make them very, very ill and kill them. In fact, the wildlife managers who are dealing with this have learned that they cannot save these birds. They've tried, they've not been able to find a way to get these birds to recover. And so they are euthanizing any bird that is brought to them. So it's primarily juveniles, but not exclusively. And it has been primarily in grackles and jays. But there have also been starlings and robins, both turned in to the people who are studying this and reported to them. Here is the official statement that was released on June 9 about this disease, which is still unknown. But the people who are trying to figure it out have had to act as if, move on the premise that it is communicable. And one of the ways that birds can communicate disease to each other is at bird feeders and in bird baths. And in fact, we know this because finches have long been subject to a kind of conjunctivitis, which blinds them. It's not the same disease, a different disease, but the finches get this blinding conjunctivitis, and that is known to be spread at bird feeders, which is why even after we figure out what this current disease is and are able to go back to feeding birds, it is so important to keep your bird feeders clean. But for now, the people studying this are asking that you bring the bird feeders in, that you cease feeding the birds until it has concluded, that you clean the feeders and any bird baths with a 10% bleach solution or any other solution that will achieve the same kind of sterility as that. I was very concerned about this because of my first slide where I was recommending that we should be providing water, and asked, do we need to bring our bird baths in? There has been, this statement does not say to bring your bird baths in, but some other releases and stories are talking about bringing bird baths in. I talked to two different people who are involved in studying this, and they both told me that they have brought their bird baths in. So it is highly recommended. It is not mandated. It is mandated that you keep those bird baths super clean. You can decide for yourself whether you want to actually remove the bird bath or not. But if you follow the example of those who are studying it, you will bring them in. It also says to avoid handling the birds. If you must handle the birds, use disposable gloves. Use all sorts of precautions because they do not know how this disease is transmitted, and they certainly don't want it potentially jumping into humans. One of the people that I spoke to added to pass along to you to also avoid when you clean your bird baths, don't bring them inside to your kitchen sink. Do that outside. You don't want to mix the bird baths or the bird feeders with your food area. Keep it safe, keep it separate. Certainly do not let your pets get at these sick or dead birds. A couple other things to add is that I was really pleased, and I feel good about passing on to you guys that both of these experts that I spoke with said that they really feel that they are close to finding an answer as to what this disease is. They didn't give me a time frame, but it sounds like they're just really trying to nail it down. They want to be completely sure before they make any public releases, but I'm thinking we're going to hear pretty quickly about what it actually is. And one really nice suggestion from one of these people was to say, you know, if you are somebody who usually feeds birds, there are some people who are really suffering from this, and that is people who run bird supply stores. And so if you want to do somebody a solid, go and buy some, you know, bird food or a new feeder. If you've been thinking about replacing your feeder, well, just throw out the old bad one and have one that you know is completely clean because it's new, and spend that money now. So that's what we've got going on here. It is a bad moment, and we need to be very careful with our birds and really treat this disease seriously, but it looks like we're going to have some answers very soon. And I am at my first point for questions.
Hey, Alyssa, we do have a handful of questions here. The first one is about hollow bamboo stalks. And is that a viable option for someone who can't leave the plant stems up, possibly because of HOA or condo rules?
I want to make sure I heard you right. Did you say bamboo stalks?
Yes, hollow bamboo stalks as an alternative to stems.
Hollow bamboo. Not really. Most bamboo, especially if it's big, is too big. Also, I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to grow bamboo, which is one of our most nasty invasives. Basically, if you plant some of the plants that we'll be recommending, you'll be growing some of those stalks very soon. Just start looking at the plants right. If you don't have it, don't try to fake it. But in fact, I should say those bee houses that people are buying can be problematic. A lot of them are not really built well. They're too shallow for how the bees actually need to lay their eggs. Most bees that use those kind of things need quite a bit of length, and they can get parasites in them very easily, and then they become kind of death traps. Whereas if you grow a plant that has a good hollow stalk, that stalk is going to be used up and essentially start disintegrating before it gets reused.
Okay, great. Now we have a couple questions about pesticides.
Yeah.
One is whether cedar oil is better than other pesticides to use. Doesn't specify on what type of pest, but just in general, is cedar oil better than other pesticides?
You know, I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to answer that because I have not researched it, but I will be happy to research it. And in the 1 or 2 weeks that it'll take me to get this presentation closed captioned, I will have an answer. And any question that I cannot answer, I will try to put an answer posted on the MGMV website, the virtual classroom part of it. I'm sorry, I just don't know. My guess is that the cedar oil is supposed to simply have a smell that would keep insects away. And if that's the case, then sure, that's not, if it's not supposed to kill them, if it's just supposed to keep them away because they don't like the smell, that's a good thing. And if it works, then great. Anything that is simply a smell that the insects don't like, great, try it out. But if it is actually a pesticide that's supposed to kill them, I would want to research that.
Okay. And then the other pesticide question was about fireflies, and if the drop in fireflies that we've all noticed is attributable to pesticide use.
It is partly attributable to pesticide use. It is also attributable to the fact that we are cleaning up our leaves and making pretty tidy yards. Fireflies also use leaf litter to overwinter. And if we rake up all those leaves, we are raking away all the firefly babies.
Okay. All right. We have a question or a couple questions about some native plants and native replacements. One question is whether, if the resident is in DC, whether native plants of Northern Virginia and Maryland are still considered native and okay to use in DC.
A great question. And the answer is most likely that anything that is native in Northern Virginia is probably also native in DC. But the fact of the matter is that there are exceptions to that rule. And I am not an expert on the native plants of DC. There would need to be a little bit of research. Certainly, if it's close by, it's probably not going to be a big problem plant. So I would be really shocked if any of the plants that are in our Plant Nova Natives guide are problems in DC. But if you want to know for sure, that would need to be researched out plant by plant. And there are ways to do that. You can simply put in the name of the plant, preferably the scientific Latin name of the plant, and ask, is it native in DC? And you'll probably be able to find out.
Okay. And I think this answer is related very much to the next question too, about a replacement, a good native replacement for the Nepeta plant. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. Nepeta?
Nepeta? The catmint? Maybe?
Oh, catmint as a replacement.
Okay. Well, that's a really good question. It kind of depends on why they wanted to grow catmint, whether it's because they like the color of the flowers, whether they like the low bushy habit of it. I have some Monarda punctata, spotted bee balm, which is a great native plant that is also kind of low and bushy. So is Zizia, or Sweet Alexander, which I showed a picture of. It was the yellow flowers. So if it's the low bushy look, those would be a couple of possibilities. If it's purple color, we have a number of nice purple plants, including Liatris, and there's various kinds of Liatris, including a few that are lower than Liatris spicata, the gay flower that is the most common kind of Liatris. I'm hoping that that's a good start. I will certainly be happy to look into that and see if I can add to that list when we post answers.
Great. And then we have just a few follow-up bird questions. So one is with the sick and dying birds that we've come across lately. Have we heard about this in Pennsylvania as well? Or have you heard about it in Pennsylvania as well?
I have not. That only speaks to what I've heard. It's not an authoritative answer. But given that we're hearing about it in other states, I would not be surprised.
Okay. And then one is about ceramic owls to keep birds out of vegetable gardens and berry bushes. And what do you think this is okay? Do you think it works?
Sure. First of all, I have to say that my kind of specialty area, particularly with the Audubon at home work that I do, is bringing wildlife into a garden, not keeping it out of a garden. Kirsten Conrad, our extension agent, has done a wonderful presentation about dealing with the creatures that come into your yard. It is on the Master Gardener's virtual classroom, and I would highly recommend looking at that. I have not actually tried a ceramic owl. I know that some people like it, some people don't. I think that the birds, after a while, they kind of learn, oh, it's not alive, it's not going to chase me, and you can probably find photos of birds perching on top of a ceramic owl head. So, I don't think it's bad. There's nothing wrong with it. And if it's a cute ceramic owl, go for it. But I wouldn't say it's the best way. Certainly exclusion is the very best way to keep birds out of where you're trying to grow vegetables.
And then another question is about hummingbirds. This person has reported not seeing many hummingbirds this year in the garden. And is this something you've encountered yourself? Is there a problem with hummingbirds this year that you're aware of or anything?
I have not heard about any problems locally with hummingbirds. Right now, hummingbirds are kind of wrapping up their breeding for the year. And in my own garden, it's real interesting. My husband is able to track where the hummingbirds are in their migration. We only have generally ruby-throated hummingbirds, and they do migrate up from South America. Believe it or not, those little tiny guys will spend up to a couple days flying over the Gulf of Mexico to get up here. When they first arrive, they tend to go to places where they have nested before. And their first order of business is having their babies and raising their young. Once they're done, there's what is called the post-breeding dispersal, and the hummingbirds will then go away from the specific places where they've had their nests and tend to be found in a lot more places. And that's when we've had them come to our yard. I've never had nesting hummingbirds in my yard, although I hold out hope. Now, there's a possibility that the person who asked this question has had nesting hummingbirds in their yard in the past, and maybe those particular hummingbirds died and haven't come back this year. But hopefully, if they've had nesting hummingbirds in their yard, then it's a good yard, and some other hummingbirds will find it in future years. So I haven't heard problems. I should say, just to clarify, that because I forgot to say this, on the issue of the bird diseases, hummingbird feeders are included in that idea of taking bird feeders down. They want you to take hummingbird feeders down, which I know is particularly hard on a lot of us because seeing hummingbirds is such a great joy.
Okay, well, thank you, Alyssa. That's all the questions we have for right now.
Okay, we're going to move on, and I'm going to keep moving quicker and quicker. This was the most intense part of the presentation. We will move on now, but before I do, I just should say, because I forgot to identify, that this is a barred owl, B-A-R-R-E-D, a barred owl, which is fairly common in Arlington and Alexandria. So we're going to look at 7 great sustenance plants to consider. And they are plants that provide berries, seeds, or nectar to birds. And these little babies are Acadian flycatcher babies. And this is an American redstart, if you want to know what these birds are. So our first plant is a sweet bay magnolia, which is a beautiful understory tree, doesn't get very tall, Magnolia virginiana. It is semi-evergreen. As we have warmer winters, it may be ever more evergreen and not drop many of its leaves. It has beautiful creamy white flowers in late spring, early summer, and they smell kind of lemony. It attracts a number of different kinds of birds, and it is a larval host for a couple of butterflies and moths. It's just a really nice, I think, underappreciated understory tree. It can take a fair amount of sun, but it can absolutely go under the larger trees, providing an additional layer that we were talking about. And this one has one of the tried and true fact sheets available, and I'm only going to mention this the first time because a lot of our plants have tried and true fact sheets available. And if you're not familiar with them, they are on the mgnv.org website under plants. And they're a wonderful full page of information, including photos and a lot of information about what the plant is like, cultural tips, and also what it might be a good replacement for as far as invasive plants. So we have a lot of them, and I think they're one of the great assets of our mgnv.org website. Now, if you don't want, for some reason, to do a sweetback magnolia, there's a good alternative that I like to recommend, the downy serviceberry. And here you can see Mrs. Cardinal eating the serviceberries, which are, by the way, not only good for birds to eat, but people too, if you can manage to harvest them before the birds do. Our next plant is the winterberry, the Ilex verticillata. And I don't know if you can hear this video. I put this in. This is one of my favorite videos. I have a story here. This is a winterberry bush over at the Glen Carlin Library Garden, right by the parking lot. And as you can see, it sets these stunning berries. And for a number of years, this wonderful pair of mockingbirds have claimed it as their territory. And almost every time in winter that I pull up, there's this male mockingbird. Well, a couple years ago, he, in the spring then, did what mockingbirds do, and he hopped up here on the reserved sign to say that this was his reserved area and mark his territory with song, which is what mockingbirds do. They repeat their song 3 to 5 times. It's one of the things that helps you know that it's a mockingbird if you can only hear it. And he sits up there and he just sings as loud as he can to let other males know that this is his area and they should stay away. So I went ahead and videotaped him singing because I thought it was so cool. And lo and behold, when I went to make sure that I'd actually taped it correctly and I was playing it back, he dive bombed me because he thought that I was another male singing and challenging his territory. So that's my mockingbird and winterberry story here. The winterberry is a wonderful native shrub, and they can get pretty tall, up to 12 feet tall, although there are smaller cultivars available if you want. I've been referring to them as berries, but they're technically drupes, meaning that they've got a little tiny pit in them like a cherry. A cherry is a drupe. They set it in late summer, and then they drop their leaves. So here's what it looks like when they first set their berries. But then they drop their leaves, and the berries just look fabulous. And they tend to persist through much of the winter. For whatever reason, the mockingbirds don't really eat them in early winter. A lot of the birds that like them tend to eat them in a little bit late winter. I'm not sure if it's because the cold changes their flavor or they just don't like them as much and they eat other things first, but they certainly do eat them. And they are so festive and beautiful. Now, what you need to know about winterberry is that they are dioecious, meaning that the plants are either male or female. And you need to have both if you want those berries, which are the babies of the plant, essentially, if you want those berries to set. And I have a very sad story. When we first bought our home, I put 4 winterberries in the backyard, one of which was a male, and they've been kind of slow to grow. But later on, I decided I wanted 4 more on the side of the house. So I bought another set of 4, 1 male, 3 female, or so I thought. I started suspecting that that male was not as male as he ought to be. And lo and behold, I just recently had it confirmed that when I learned, due to the help of my friend Elaine Mills, that these flowers, these are the female flowers, that poor shrub that I thought was a male was in fact a female. And no wonder none of my shrubs had been setting good berries there on the side, because the only male was a long ways away. So my task for this fall will be to dig out a forsythia that is not native, and I will replace it with the male. It's close to the 4 females that I now have. So be careful when you buy that you're buying from a reputable source and that you're really getting the plants that you want. There is a cultivar that sets rather golden colored berries or orangey color. And interestingly enough, the birds I think they're nutritious berries, but the birds don't recognize them as food. And so they often don't get eaten, or maybe at the very last minute. But if you're trying to plant for birds, I would not recommend that you do the golden one. Winterberries do like to be in a moist area, so don't go for a really dry spot. And if you decide that winterberry just isn't quite the plant for you, a different shrub that has beautiful winter color is the redwood dogwood, Cornus sericea. It is not, unfortunately, strictly native here in the Northern Virginia area, but it is in the Chesapeake Bay area. So not a bad choice, not quite as native as the others. Another wonderful shrub that is really a powerhouse is spicebush, Lindera benzoin. This is another dioecious plant. Its height, depending on how tall it grows, 6.5 to 16 feet. You may think of it as a shrub, or you may think of it as a small tree. It can take sun or shade. It's often one of those understory shrubs in our native areas, and that is in part because it is fairly deer resistant. The name spicebush reflects the fact that there is a smell and a flavor to this shrub that the deer don't happen to like. So it is one of the shrubs that's doing relatively well, even in our heavily deer-browsed native areas. And if you have problems with deer browse, this may be a good shrub for you. But it's a really good shrub for birds because the drupes have a really high fatty lipid content and are really great for birds. The foliage in the spring is really pretty. I feel like it looks like yellow lace kind of globbed up and thrown about the landscape when you have a number of them. I think I just said that it's dioecious. The problem with this is that unlike winterberry, where you can purchase plants that you know are male and female, I have yet to find anybody who sells spicebush already sexed. And that's because they don't usually bloom until they're a bit bigger, and it's only by the bloom that you can tell which sex it is. So my advice for you is that if you want spicebush, which really is a great plant, that you should put in 3 or 4 or 5 if you can, and hope that you get at least one of each sex. Or talk some of your friends into planting spice bush, some of your neighbors, excuse me, so that the pollinators that are going between your yard and the yard just over the fence will be pollinating. I actually did that with my neighbor, and just yesterday, she showed me her spice bush on the other side of the fence. I also have, I think, 5 spice bush in my own yard, and they have bloomed now, and I do know that I've got them of both sexes, which is really great. I mentioned that they're aromatic. They have been used since Native American times for food, and people like to make teas out of them. They are the host of the spice bush swallowtail, and here's the caterpillar, which I think is so adorable. They really attract a lot of birds. But if this is not the shrub for you, a great alternative to consider is the black chokeberry, which has wonderful berries. I've put 2 of these in my front yard just in the last year, and I'm really pleased with how they're looking. The next plant is the trumpet honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. And this, to me, is the plant that you put in if you want to have hummingbirds. This photo is not of the ruby-throated hummingbirds that we typically have around here. This is the wonderful little rufous hummingbird, female hummingbird, who did this year what occasionally, quite rarely happens. Sometimes hummingbirds from other parts of the country get confused on their migration and end up in the wrong spot. This little girl should have ended up in the mountains of Mexico, but instead of going south, she headed east and ended up at Green Street Gardens in off of Little River Turnpike, where they had a Lonicera. They actually had several Lonicera that were still blooming when she arrived in very early winter. The name Lonicera sempervirens actually means semi-evergreen. And sure enough, this plant stays semi-evergreen, and even sometimes in milder winters has some blooms. So she quickly found some nectar to keep her going, and the wonderful people there at Green Spring immediately put up both a feeder, a nectar feeder for her, and a warming lamp, and she made it through the winter. And lots of people got wonderful shots of her, but I loved this shot and was so grateful that I was allowed to use it. This is my Lonicera sempervirens on the front of my house. You can see it can get to be very big. I had this trellis specially built for me, and it actually detaches at the top and rotates at the bottom. So if and when we need to repaint our house, I can just lean that entire trellis with the honeysuckle forward and paint behind it. If you want to do something on your house, you may want to do something similar, because this is a big vine. There is a variety of it that was found in Gloucester, Virginia, and it is a smaller plant. It has all yellow flowers, and we think it was a naturally occurring cultivar. It does like to get the sun. It will grow in the shade. It just won't bloom quite as well. It also likes moist soil. You can put it on a trellis or use it as ground cover. It hosts several moths, and this is really almost the guarantee that you'll get hummingbirds. If you don't like this by any chance, however, and you want a different vine, here is an alternative cross vine, Bignonia capreolata, which is also semi-evergreen. And at the Glen Carlin Library Garden, we have it on some chain link fence that is providing privacy. Another plant are native sunflowers, Helianthus. This is actually also a keystone species, which I'll be talking about in just a minute. These native sunflowers are very happy. They really attract a lot of pollinators, as you can see in this little video, how every flower has pollinators on it. But the reason that I included it is this, and I'm sorry for the quality of this photo, it's taken through a screen window. I have a Jerusalem artichoke that is just in front of the window that I look out of as I'm getting dressed. And all year long, I have these flocks of goldfinches coming in to feed off those seed heads. So I know that the goldfinches absolutely love the seed on the helianthus. Helianthus in general is a pretty aggressive group of plants, and they like to spread. Jerusalem artichoke, which I put in for food purposes, absolutely spreads. These are plants that you may want to put in great big pots or have some other way of keeping them in check. And definitely you should leave the seed heads up through winter. If you don't want to do that, if it sounds a little too aggressive, another very happy flower, composite yellow flower, are the black-eyed Susans, brown-eyed Susans, all the Rudbeckias. So, little blue stem, the grass that is so beautiful and has these kind of cool blue and purple tones is a Schizocarium scoparium. It is excellent erosion control because the roots go down to 5 feet sometimes. A lot of different birds really like the insects that use the little blue stem, and then other birds like the seed heads themselves. And it's very pretty if you leave it up through winter, and the birds will come and eat those seed heads. And it provides good wildlife cover for other critters that like to hide underneath the grasses that are left there. It hosts some skippers. I will say, interestingly enough, too much fertility or shade or too much moisture can make them kind of floppy, which is interesting. There is a cultivar that seems to be wildlife supportive called Standing Ovation, which is supposed to not flop, and the name reflects that. If that is not the grass for you, but you want to consider a grass, look at bottlebrush grass, Limus hystrix. And then I always like to have a plant that is a little startling and that people don't necessarily think is a good yard plant. But today that plant is pokeweed, Phytolacca americana. And that is a plant that most people consider weeds, but I'd like to suggest to you that it may not be a weed. As evidenced by this amazing painted bunting. A lot of you probably saw the news stories, or maybe you went out and saw the painted bunting that was a vagrant. Usually you would find them in Texas, but this last winter, this guy came up and he was hanging out in the Great Falls area, and a lot of what he was eating, if you were able to look at a lot of pictures of him, you will see that he was eating the dried up berries of pokeweed. And here he is in the snow, angling himself in such a way to get those precious berries that are really full of nutrition. The pokeweed can grow in the sun or part shade. They make these beautiful dark berries and have red stems. They attract all kinds of birds and even help the cardinals keep their feathers red. It does have a deep taproot, and that's part of the reason that people tend to hate it. They think it's so hard to get rid of, because if you don't dig the taproot out, you are going to have the pokeweed for a long time. And you can see this one actually had been cut off, and of course it resprouted because that's what taproots can do. But if you pull them out when they're very young, they come out quite easily. This taproot, by the way, is bent over because I had it in a pot for a little while before taking the picture. What I suggest, and what I have seen people successfully do, is identify 1 or 2 or 3 plants that you decide that you want to leave. And every spring, when babies come up, you just devote a little time to pull out all those little babies. but let the big guy go and do his thing. And you will be visited by plenty of mockingbirds and catbirds that particularly love this plant. I need to note that all parts of it, apparently, especially the taproot, are poisonous to humans. But if you say that on one of the plant ID groups on Facebook, you will immediately have people talking about, oh, I grew up in the South on poke salad. And apparently there is such a thing. I have not had it. I am not from the South and I did not grow up on it. Apparently, if you take the leaves of baby pokeweed and you blanch them, I don't know how many times, there's some traditional Southern salad that you eat. But I would suggest, unless you are Southern and have somebody who really knows how to do it, you don't try to eat any part of it. And in fact, I would suggest that if you have small children, you wait to nurture your pokeweed until they're old enough to understand not to eat those berries, which could be bad for them. If pokeweed is not for you, another much maligned plant that you might want to consider is Virginia creeper. And I think those berries are absolutely beautiful, and so do many of our native birds. And we are to another point for questions. And this, by the way, is a tree swallow.
Sorry, Alyssa. We actually don't have any questions right now. I think you're just covering everything so thoroughly. We're good to go.
Okay, then I'm going to go on and blaze through our last group of plants.
Oh, 1 second, Colleen, you're on mute. Oh, there you are.
Okay, there was just one question about if you know if there's any source for pokeweed.
Oh, interesting question that I have looked into myself because I wanted to get pokeweed into my backyard. I did not have it naturally occurring. And I did look at several of our native plant nurseries and they did not have it. And of course, you're not really supposed to dig things out of native areas. What I was prepared to do and what I would suggest to people is to post a request on a listserv. If you belong to any, community listserv, just say, I know it's crazy, but I want a pokeweed. Does anyone have young pokeweed that you'll let me come dig up? I ended up not having to do that because I work with people in their gardens and I've just encountered someone who had some. So I said it to her face and she's like, oh yeah, sure. And she was nice enough to actually give me a little pot and say, here, take it with you. So that's what that pokeweed was. Okay, anything else?
There was one question about, can you suggest any plants that are good for birds that also grow in shade?
A number of those that I just talked about. I mean, the pokeweed grows in the shade, the spice bush grows in the shade, the winterberry can take shade. I will try to put a little more of a list when we post this, but yeah, there's a number that grow in the shade.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. That's good.
Okay. So onward to 7 keystone plants. And what I want to do is explain what a keystone plant is. Keystone refers to the ancient Roman arch and the fact that it was all based on this middle top stone that supported all the other stones in the arch, but the arch would not exist if the keystone wasn't there. Doug Tallamy has explained this in his wonderful books, which I suggest people read, absolutely. Here's the deal. Not all native plants are as supportive as others. As Tallamy says here, 75% of the insect food required by birds and other plants is produced by just a few plant genera. And you can have a lot of biodiversity in your landscape, but if you don't have at least a few keystone plants, it's really not going to be enough. So before we move on, here is a mockingbird and here is a baby wren sleeping. Our first keystone plant is the top of the heap, the white oak. white oaks support the most different kinds of Lepidoptera, and we're judging Keystone by how many kinds of Lepidoptera it supports. White oaks have not always been America's top keystone plant. It used to be the American chestnut, which unfortunately was wiped out by the Asian blight that makes the chestnuts not reproduce. I am fascinated by the story of trying to bring chestnuts back. That's a whole different story, worth a number of lectures right there. But with the death of the chestnuts, the white oaks have stepped into that spot as top of the heap to support wildlife in our American forests. Through most of the country where the oaks are, that is the top. Oaks can be divided into two families, white and red. And if you don't know this, the way you can tell the difference between an oak in the white family versus the red family is, if you can see in this picture, these are very smooth lobes. The tip is very smooth. If it's a red oak, there will be a bristle there. No matter what the shape is, at the tip of whatever there is, there will be a bristle. If it's in the white oak family, there is no bristle. This is a white oak. And that's how I was able to tell that this Mississippi kite was in a white oak tree, because I can see how smooth those leaves are there. So in the white oak family in Northern Virginia, there's several different plants that are in that family. And that includes the swamp white oak, the chinquapin oak, the overcup oak, the chestnut oak, the post oak, and of course the northern white oak. These support more than 530 kinds of Lepidoptera. It varies from place to place, depending on what kind of Lepidoptera there are and what kind of oak trees there are and how many oaks there are. Interestingly enough, I went into this thinking that certainly squirrels are who plant the most acorns to grow the most trees. And because I read Doug Tallamy's wonderful new book that I highly recommend called The Nature of Oaks, I learned that blue jays actually plant more acorns than squirrels do. And here's a blue jay with the acorn in his mouth. They will fly up to a mile from the parent oak tree to plant an oak. They plant about 4,000 acorns. They are planning to come back and eat those acorns, but each year they usually remember only about a quarter of those acorns. So if you take 1,000 acorns that they harvest away from the 4,000 that they planted, they've planted about 3,000 oaks, and it's a really nice variety because they're mixing it up. It's not just the same kind of oak right underneath where it has dropped its acorns. One important thing that I want you to know, even though oak is, you know, the traditional oak can be up to 100 feet tall, there are cultivars that are meant for small yards. And there are some, you know, depending on where you are, there are some smaller oaks, but also cultivars. So don't think that just because you have a small yard, an oak is impossible. Do a little research, Google small oaks, and you will find that there are more than you think. Black cherry is another keystone plant that we have in abundance in our Northern Virginia area. They are not quite as big as the oaks. They have these pretty flowers on racemes, is what we call that sort of candle of white blossoms. Unfortunately, they're often quite high up and you don't get to see them or smell them if you're around a really mature tree. But then they make these small cherries that are really wonderful. The insects love the flowers, and then the birds like to eat the insects that are attracted to the flowers, and then later on, the birds will eat the cherries themselves. A lot of people don't like the black cherry because of the tent caterpillars that make their nests in them. They think it looks very messy, which maybe it does look messy. Here's the caterpillar itself. But here's the deal. 60 different kinds of birds like to eat the eastern tent caterpillars, and some of them even use the silk of the tent for their nests. So really, again, if you can learn to embrace this and just say, oh, look, there's some great food for the birds that I'm trying to attract in my black cherry or Prunus serratina, then you will be happy with your black cherry. Birch trees, and we're talking about birch as a species, the Betula species. There are 5 different kinds of birch that are native in Virginia, and they range in height. I've got pictures here of the 2 different kinds that we also have the fact sheets available for, the sweet birch and the river birch. They support 350 kind of Lepidoptera. They can take sun to part shade, and they like medium to moist soils. And of course, the river birch, as the name would imply, really likes moist soils. They're a classic tree to put in, for instance, a rain garden. The river birch is noted for its peeling bark, and a lot of birds like these catechins here. So that's a great plant. Eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. White pine, in case you want to know how to identify a white pine from, for instance, a Virginia pine, white pine has, if you count the number of needles in one of these little bundles, there's always 5 needles. And you can remember that because there's 5 letters in the word white. So that's the white pine. They attract all sorts of birds that love the pine nuts. The eastern bluebirds, and I think we already saw a picture of a robin nest that had the needles in the nest. And the fact that they're evergreen and quite dense throughout the year is a really important thing for a lot of birds, providing shelter and safety. Owls in particular, I know I've been out with my husband, and when he's looking for owls, there are a few different stretches of pines that he looks in, and any kind of a evergreen really, but pines are one of them, that he looks in to find where the owls like to roost, way up at the top. You have to look up there and look for kind of a big blob towards the top, and that might be an owl. Blueberries, vaccinium. Blueberries actually include, the family Vaccinium includes both cranberries and deerberries. I am not familiar with deerberries, but I'm certainly familiar with cranberries. Blueberries are such a pretty plant. They turn this beautiful red color in fall, and they support more than 270 kind of Lepidoptera. They're very attractive to all sorts of birds who love the berries. And those are the same berries that we eat. I put this question in here because, again, I was on a Facebook plant ID group and someone posted a picture of a blueberry plant that they didn't know what it was. And everybody chimed in, it's a blueberry. And then the original poster said, are they edible? And everybody's like, yes, it's a blueberry. It's the blueberry that we eat and everybody likes. If you want them for yourself, you may need to figure out some way to exclude the birds. They host several different Lepidoptera. Blueberries are available in both high bush and low bush varieties, and you can see there's a considerable difference in the height. The low bush is only up to 2 feet, whereas the high bush can get up to 12 feet. And you could prune that to look like a small tree if you want it, although if you want to eat them, don't do that because you won't be able to reach them. Blueberry plants are self-fertile, but if you really want good berry set, which I assume you do, either for yourself or for the birds, you need to have more than one variety. If it's not a straight species, then if you've got a cultivar, you need to have more than one kind that can cross-pollinate, and they need to be blooming at the same time. And that's when you'll get the best berries. Now, here's an important thing about blueberries if you want to grow them, and it gives me the chance to give the classic master gardener advice about doing a soil test. Blueberries really like acid soil from 4 to 6.5 range. So this is a plant where you really should be doing a soil test in advance to find out what the acidity, what the pH is of your soil. They're easy to do. They're available from the master gardeners. It's only $10 to do the test. You'll learn so much about your soil, not only the pH, but the levels of fertility of various important elements. And if you need to make your soil more acid, it's pretty easy to do, but you don't want to try to acidify your soil unless and until you know that it needs to be done. If you want to really control that, you may want to put your blueberry, particularly if you're doing a low bush blueberry, in a pot. And I have seen people do that quite successfully. Our sixth keystone plant is asters, which is both the Symphyotrichum and Eurybia species. There are all kinds of different asters, and they support all sorts of Lepidoptera. And they attract birds that like to eat the seed heads after the bloom has stopped. Depending on the variety, you've got quite a wide range. The white wood aster really likes the shade. I have white wood aster that I have been thrilled has spread throughout my backyard. It acts almost as a ground cover. I sometimes go ahead and cut it down. In fact, all asters are a good plant to consider cutting down as it's growing. Up to the beginning of July, you can cut that plant up to in half in order to make its bloom denser and less tall. I usually cut mine in early May and then again sometime in June to make them be a little bushier and nicer. And again, with the asters, you can find a variety for almost any condition that you have. This blue wood aster is also very nice in shade. It can take the shade. And these are late bloomers, so there's lots of color late in the season, just when everything else seems to be putzing out. Its partner in many ways is the goldenrod, the solidago species, which also bloom in the late summer or fall. And there's at least 10 types that are native in the Chesapeake Bay watershed area. Again, cut it back if you want it to be more dense. This photo here is an example of this plant would have probably been maybe up to twice as tall, except that it got pinched back over and over. This is my solidago last year, the first year I had planted it. And if you can look at this video, you can see there are pollinators just all over. People often confuse goldenrod with the ragweed, which is wind pollinated and therefore does cause a lot of hay fever. But goldenrod is not wind pollinated. It is pollinated by insects and so forth, and it does not cause hay fever. And another good thing about it is that the deer very rarely, seldom damage it. So there you've got my little advertisement for the Audubon at Home program that I'm involved with. So that is the goldenrod. And then just because keystone plants are so very important, I didn't want you to think that there were only the 8 that I have covered in this presentation. I've got a dozen more listed here. Now, I got these from the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder, which I have in the links section for you that we'll get to in a moment and was also in your handout. And the way that the National Wildlife Federation's Native Plant Finder works is that you put in your zip code to find out which are the top keystone species for your zip code and how many insects, Lepidoptera, it supports in your zip code. So I just chose my own, which is South Arlington. I couldn't put in multiple, and so that's why I've said it's just Arlington. But I encourage you to go to the Native Plant Finder and do this with your own zip code and find out what comes up for you. If you're in Northern Virginia, it will be very similar to this list, plus the ones that I've already talked about. But if you're in another part of the country, you'll find the ones that are tops for you. So this is really great. So that's a few more for you to consider. Here are some of the resources that, if this has just opened up a world of questions for you, I hope that you will go ahead and take a look at. Certainly, I know I've already been touting the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website, and here's the link for the Tried and True Selections plant information sheets that I've been talking about. Audubon at Home, which I'm involved with, has a terrific website that has lots of information about what's good for birds. You'll see a lot of what I've presented here echoed there, but you might find some more specifics. Here's the Native Plant Finder I was just talking about. A different database on native plants that is really terrific is the Audubon Native Plant Database. And you can search individually, and you'll actually, on specific plants, get even more information than on the National Wildlife Federation's one. And then Doug Tallamy, who you've heard me speaking a good deal about, has the Homegrown National Park website, where he invites people to join together and register their yards as part of the Homegrown National site. Plant Nova Natives has a wonderful website with specific pages on gardening for songbirds and gardening for hummingbirds. If you want to know where to get native plant sales, they have a link, and that's updated each season. And then the Native Plants Guide, I already showed you the published book, but it's all online. You can download it for free. And finally, a few references that of things that were helpful to me in putting this presentation together. And I particularly want to call out this book by Sharon Sorensen, Planting Native to Attract Birds to Your Yard. If you liked what you learned here and want to dig further, that's a great book that really helped me a lot. And we are to the last section of questions.
Okay, Alyssa, we just actually had one question in this session about whether blueberries need both male and female plants. And Elaine jumped in, but you might want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, they are not dioecious. They are able to, they have both sexes within the plant, so they can self-fertilize. But as I said, if they're different cultivars, they're going to do better if you've got two different kinds.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you so much for such a thorough and topical presentation. The breadth of your knowledge is very impressive. And when you review the chat box, you'll see how many people really appreciated this talk. So thank you very much. And thanks everyone for attending. We always enjoy seeing where everyone's from and seeing so many people show up. And Julie actually posted a list of the upcoming talks, which you can register for. So thank you and goodbye to you all.
Thank you.
Bye.